On July 9, 1944, in a stone farmhouse outside Caumont-le-Venté, a German intelligence officer sat behind a wooden table covered with American equipment. 3 M1 helmets had been placed in a row, still carrying the mud and salt of Normandy. 2 had been taken from dead men. 1 had been found in a ditch, its liner still damp. He turned the first helmet in his hands. On the front, a small blue and gray circle, a divisional emblem, painted in the open where anyone with binoculars could read it from 200 meters. On the back, a single white vertical stripe, roughly an inch wide, running from the rim toward the crown. He set it down and picked up the second. Same stripe, same position, same careless visibility. The third helmet was different. No divisional mark. Instead, on both sides, a white spade, like a playing card, with a small tick mark at the 6 o'clock position. He had never seen anything like it. He wrote a single line in his report that would later be filed with the intelligence section of the 352nd Infantry Division. The Americans appeared to be marking their leaders deliberately, in a manner visible to the enemy. He underlined the word deliberately. In a German rifle company, an officer's rank lived on his shoulder boards, woven braids and pips tucked under a camouflage smock, invisible at 30 meters. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had ordered all divisional insignia removed from vehicles on the Eastern Front. By June of 1944, the order extended to the Western Front. Every unit marking scraped off, painted over, hidden. The logic was obvious. If the enemy can identify your unit, he can predict your next move. If he can identify your officers, he can kill them first. And yet here were these Americans, painting white stripes on their leaders' helmets, painting unit symbols where any sniper could see them, not hiding a thing. If you want to see how a painted stripe on a steel helmet reveals an entire philosophy of American leadership, a like and a subscribe help these stories find the audience they deserve. The German officer's confusion was reasonable. It made perfect sense inside the system he knew. In the Wehrmacht, information was vertical. Orders came from above. The Leutnant received orders from the Hauptmann from the Major from the Oberst. Each man carried the plan in his head. When a German officer fell, the plan often fell with him, because the men below him had been told what to do, not why. The stripe on the back of that American helmet was the opposite of everything that system stood for. It said, "I am the one you follow." And it said it not to the enemy, but to the 19-year-old rifleman walking 5 meters behind, who had been in France for 72 hours and had never heard a shot fired in anger. The Americans called it the "Follow Me" bar. A vertical white stripe meant officer. A horizontal stripe meant NCO, a sergeant, a squad leader, a man who in the German army would never have been trusted with the kind of authority the American army was about to hand him. And here is the detail worth remembering. The stripe was painted on the back of the helmet, not the front, the back. It was not meant for the man facing the enemy. It was meant for the men behind the leader, so that in smoke, in dust, in the hedgerow dark of Normandy, a private who had lost his bearings could look up, find that white line, and know which direction to move. The Germans painted nothing on their helmets except a national shield that most frontline troops had stopped wearing by 1943. Their Stahlhelm was blank. Their system did not need a "Follow Me" bar because their system did not expect a private to choose whom to follow. A private followed orders. Period. But the American army had built something that the German intelligence officer staring at those 3 helmets could not have recognized, because it contradicted a principle that had governed European armies for 200 years. The principle that the man at the top holds the plan, and when he dies, the plan must be rebuilt from above. The Americans were not marking their leaders to make them easier to find. They were marking them because they had already assumed those leaders would be killed, and they needed every man in the squad to know, at a glance, in the middle of chaos, who was still alive and in charge. That white stripe was not identification. It was a contingency plan, painted in enamel. And the full scope of what that meant, the system behind it, the training philosophy it revealed, the terrifying speed at which American units could absorb the loss of every officer in a company and keep fighting, was something that German commanders would not fully understand until it was far too late. It begins with a decision made in England, 2 weeks before the largest amphibious invasion in history. And it begins with a deck of playing cards. In late May of 1944, somewhere in southern England, the 4 infantry regiment commanders of the 101st Airborne Division sat in a briefing room and solved a problem that no army in history had ever solved before. The problem was this. In a few days, more than 6,000 paratroopers would jump into Normandy in the dark. They would exit their C-47s at 600 feet in sticks of 15 to 18 men over a countryside none of them had ever seen. Wind, flak, and pilot error would scatter them across miles of hedgerow, marsh, and flooded farmland. Most would land nowhere near their drop zones. Many would land alone. And in the dark, in a foreign field, wearing identical uniforms, carrying identical weapons, every man would need to answer one question before he could do anything useful. Who is next to me, and are they mine? The solution was almost absurdly simple. Someone produced a deck of playing cards. The 4 regiment commanders each drew a suit. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment got spades. The 502nd got hearts. The 501st got diamonds. The 327th Glider Infantry got clubs. A small tick mark at the 12 o'clock position meant Headquarters Company. 3 o'clock meant 1st Battalion. 6 o'clock, 2nd. 9 o'clock, 3rd. Within days, every helmet in the 101st Airborne had a playing card suit painted on both sides in white. A man landing in a flooded ditch outside Sainte-Mère-Église could crawl to the nearest hedgerow, spot another helmet in the moonlight, and know in half a second whether the man wearing it belonged to his regiment and which battalion he came from. Think about what that means. The system was not designed for order. It was designed for the absence of order. It assumed that the plan would fail. It assumed that radios would break, that officers would die in the air, that entire companies would land in the wrong field. And it assumed that when all of that happened, the individual soldier, the private, the corporal, the buck sergeant, would need enough information painted on the outside of a steel helmet to begin rebuilding a fighting unit from scratch. No European army had ever put that much faith in the individual rifleman. The 82nd Airborne, jumping alongside the 101st, used a different system, small unit symbols and colored dots, but the principle was identical. Every helmet was a signal. Every signal assumed chaos. Now hold that thought, because what happened after midnight on June 6th proved that the men who designed those markings were not being pessimistic. They were being accurate. The drops were a catastrophe. Thick cloud cover broke apart the tight formations the pilots had rehearsed for weeks. Anti-aircraft fire forced planes to climb, dive, accelerate. Paratroopers exited at speeds and altitudes far outside the safe window. Men from the 506th landed in the 502nd zone. Men from the 500 first landed in fields flooded by the Germans, water chest deep, and drowned under 70 pounds of equipment. Entire sticks came down miles from their objectives. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the 101st Airborne Division, on paper a precisely organized force of 6,600 men, existed as a constellation of lost individuals and tiny groups scattered across a rectangle of Norman countryside, roughly 15 miles wide and 10 miles deep. And this is where the helmets began to work. A private from the 506th 2nd Battalion lands in a pasture he cannot identify. He has no radio. His platoon leader's parachute did not open. He crouches behind a stone wall, alone, and hears movement. A shape appears, low, moving fast. He sees, in the thin light, a white spade on the side of a helmet. Tick mark at 6 o'clock. Same regiment, same battalion. He clicks his cricket, the small brass noisemaker issued to every paratrooper, and gets 2 clicks back. Now there are 2. Within 20 minutes, there are 7. None of them are from the same platoon. None of them have seen an officer. The senior man is a staff sergeant from a weapons squad. He has a horizontal stripe on the back of his helmet. He takes command. They do not wait for orders from above. There are no orders from above. They move toward the sound of gunfire because their training taught them that when you are lost, move toward the fight and you will find your mission. This is the detail the German intelligence officer could not have understood from looking at 3 helmets on a table. The markings were not simply labels. They were the visible edge of a training philosophy that had taken the United States Army 3 years to build. A philosophy that said, we will lose our officers. We will lose our radios. We will lose our maps. And when we do, the sergeant with the horizontal stripe will take over, and the private behind him will follow that stripe, and the unit will keep fighting. The German army called its version of decentralized command Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. It was brilliant, refined over 150 years of Prussian military thought. It gave officers freedom to decide how to accomplish a mission. But it gave that freedom to officers. To men who had spent years in military academies, who had been trained from the age of 18 to think in operational terms. The American Army did something that Auftragstaktik never attempted. It pushed that freedom down to the sergeant, to the corporal, in some cases, to the private first class who happened to be the last man standing. And then it painted a stripe on his helmet so that everyone behind him would know. In 1941, non-commissioned officers made up 20% of the United States Army's enlisted strength. By 1945, that number was 50%. The infantry squad grew from 8 men to 12, and its leader changed from a corporal to a sergeant, then to a staff sergeant. The American Army was not just getting bigger, it was distributing leadership downward into every squad, every fire team, every cluster of scared men in a dark field. But what that looked like on a battlefield, the actual mechanism by which an American unit absorbed the death of its officers and kept moving, is something that became visible not in Normandy, but 8 weeks later, in the hedgerow countries south of the beaches, where the Follow Me bar was about to be tested in a way that no training manual had anticipated. And it was there that German officers began to notice something that genuinely unsettled them. The bocage began less than a mile from the Normandy beaches. Hedgerows, ancient walls of earth and root, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense brush, divided the countryside into thousands of small, enclosed fields, each one a fortress. A German machine gun team could set up behind a hedgerow, cover every approach, and be invisible until it fired. An American platoon advancing across one field might take an hour and 3 casualties to clear it, only to face another identical field on the other side. In the first 3 weeks after D-Day, the American advance south from the beaches slowed to less than a mile a day. Companies that had landed at full strength were losing men faster than replacements could arrive. And the men they were losing most were the ones with stripes on their helmets. A rifle company in Normandy had 6 officers and 187 enlisted men. By late June, some companies in the 29th Infantry Division had 2 officers left. A few had 1. In the dense, close-range fighting of the hedgerows, officers and NCOs died at rates that exceeded every planning assumption. They died because they were the ones who stood up first. They died because they were the ones who moved to the gap in the hedgerow to see what was on the other side. They died because the Follow Me bar on the back of their helmet was, exactly as the German intelligence officer had suspected, a marker, and not just for the men behind them. German snipers in the bocage learned quickly. The white stripe was visible at 100 meters through a 4-power scope. A veteran sniper did not need to see rank insignia on a collar. He looked for the helmet with the stripe, because the man under that stripe was the one giving orders. Kill him, and the squad stops. That was the theory, and for a few weeks, in a few sectors, it worked. American units began to cover the stripes with mud, with strips of burlap, with netting. Some officers stopped wearing them entirely. Reports from the 29th Division noted that the follow me bars were being obscured in the field, not by order, but by survival instinct. And this is where the story a German officer would expect ends, with the Americans learning their lesson and hiding their leaders like everyone else. But that is not what happened. What happened instead is what began to unsettle German company and battalion commanders along the entire Normandy front in July of 1944. It showed up in after-action reports, in intelligence summaries, in the puzzled observations of experienced officers who had fought in Poland, in France in 1940, in Russia, men who had seen every kind of army break. They noticed that when they killed an American officer, the American unit did not stop. Not for a minute, not for 10 minutes, not for an hour. A German Hauptmann, a captain, watching through binoculars from behind a hedgerow, would see an American platoon advance across a field. He would see the lieutenant leading the platoon fall, shot by a sniper, hit by mortar fragments. It did not matter. In the German army, this was the moment. The lieutenant is down. The men hesitate. The attack stalls. The surviving NCO looks for instructions that do not come. The squad pulls back, or freezes, or dies in the open ground. But the Americans did something else. Within seconds, not minutes, seconds, a sergeant stepped forward. Sometimes it was visible in the way the squad moved, a slight contraction, bodies shifting, and then a new point man, a new direction, a new push. The sergeant did not wait for orders from the company commander. He did not radio for guidance. He assessed what he could see, made a decision, and moved. And if that sergeant was killed, the corporal behind him did the same thing. A German battalion commander near St. Lo described an engagement in which his men killed what he estimated were 3 successive leaders of a single American platoon in the span of 40 minutes. Each time, the platoon reorganized within moments and continued the attack from a slightly different angle. The German commander had expected the third death to break them. It did not. A fourth man, the commander suspected he was a private first class, led the remaining 11 men through a gap in the hedgerow and forced the German machine gun team to displace. This was not supposed to happen. In 150 years of Prussian and German military doctrine, the officer was the brain of the unit. He was trained at an academy. He was taught to read terrain, to sequence fires, to think 2 moves ahead. His NCOs were experienced, tough, professional, often brilliant at their specific tasks, but they were not trained to assume command. They were trained to execute commands. The distinction sounds academic. In a hedgerow field in Normandy, it was the difference between a unit that died with its officer and a unit that kept killing after its officer was gone. And here is what the German officer, examining those helmets, could never have known. The reason the Americans could afford to paint targets on their leaders was not bravery and not carelessness. It was redundancy. The American army had built a system in which leadership was not a single point of failure. It was a distributed function. The sergeant knew the platoon's mission. The corporal knew the squad's objective. The private knew which direction to move and what to do when he got there. Not because he was a genius, because the training system that built the American infantry, a system that had been running at industrial scale since 1942, had been specifically designed to produce soldiers who could function without the man above them. The follow me bar was not a vulnerability. It was evidence. Evidence of a system so confident in its own depth that it could mark its leaders in white paint and accept the consequences. Because when one leader fell, the next man was already trained to take his place. But the system that produced that depth, the factories, the camps, the schools that turned a peacetime army of 190,000 into a wartime force of over 8 million, had a feature that no German officer in Normandy would have believed if someone had described it to him. The Americans were not selecting their best men for leadership. They were training all of them. In 1942, the United States Army faced a math problem that no army in history had solved at this scale. It needed to take millions of civilians, farm boys from Nebraska, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Virginia, and turn them into soldiers fast enough to fight a global war on two fronts. The German army had been training professional soldiers since 1935. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. The Americans had 18 months. The man responsible for solving that problem was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, and the system he built helps explain every mark on every helmet that confused every German officer who looked at one. McNair ran Army Ground Forces, the organization that designed how the American soldier was trained. His philosophy was radical by European standards. Training should be realistic, standardized, and above all, fast. A man entered the system as a civilian. 17 weeks later, he came out the other end knowing how to shoot, how to move under fire, how to dig a fighting position, how to read a compass, how to apply a field dressing. Basic skills, hammered in by repetition, under conditions as close to combat as peacetime safety allowed. But here's the part that mattered for the hedgerows. McNair's system did not stop at individual skills. It trained men to operate as small units, squads and fire teams, and it trained them with a specific assumption baked into every exercise. The assumption was that their leaders would be gone. Squad exercises routinely removed the designated leader partway through. The assistant squad leader would take over. Then he would be killed. The next senior man would step up. The drill continued until every man in the squad had led it, even if his leadership consisted of nothing more than pointing at a hedgerow and saying, "That way." This was not officer training. This was basic infantry training. Every rifleman, every BAR man, every assistant gunner went through it. The message was not subtle. Someday the sergeant will be dead, and you will be the one making the decision. You will not have time to think. You will not have time to ask. You will decide, and you will move. No other army on earth was doing this at scale in 1943. The British trained superb small units but relied heavily on their regimental officer tradition. The right schools, the right families, the right accent. Leadership was a class, not a skill set. The Germans trained arguably the finest officers in the world. Their Kriegsakademie produced men who could plan a corps-level operation on a map case balanced on the hood of a Kübelwagen. Their Auftragstaktik gave those officers extraordinary freedom to act. But that freedom lived at the officer level. The Gefreiter, the German private first class, was trained to obey, to execute, to perform his specific function within the squad with discipline and precision. He was not trained to replace his Unteroffizier. He was not trained to make tactical decisions. He was not expected to. The American private was. And the mark on his sergeant's helmet existed because the system expected him to need it. Not as decoration, not as tradition, as a tool, a last resort navigation aid for a young man who might, in the next 30 seconds, become the leader of 11 others. Now, there is a number that makes this concrete. In 1944, the average American infantry rifle company in the European theater suffered roughly 150% casualties over the course of the campaign. That means the company was, in effect, destroyed and rebuilt 1.5 times. A company that landed in Normandy in June with 6 officers and 187 enlisted men would, by the time it reached the Rhine, have cycled through 9 officers and close to 300 enlisted replacements. Think about what that means for leadership. A platoon lieutenant might last 2 to 3 weeks in combat. A squad leader, a staff sergeant, often lasted less. The men who survived the longest were usually privates and PFCs, because they were the ones not wearing a stripe. In the German army, this rate of officer loss would have been catastrophic. And it was. By late 1944, German divisions were receiving replacement officers who had weeks of training instead of years. The Wehrmacht system, built on the assumption that leadership required deep professional education, could not produce officers fast enough to replace the ones it was losing. Units that lost their experienced officers deteriorated rapidly, not because the enlisted men were cowardly, but because the system had never taught them to function without an officer telling them what to do. The American system absorbed the same losses and kept producing functional squads. Not because American soldiers were braver or smarter, because the training pipeline had already prepared every man in the squad to do the sergeant's job. Badly, imperfectly, but well enough to keep the squad moving. The follow me bar was, in this light, something much stranger than a leadership marker. It was an admission, painted on the back of a steel helmet in white enamel, that the American Army expected to lose the man wearing it, and had already trained the man walking behind him to take over when it happened. This was the depth that German officers could feel on the battlefield, but could not explain in their reports. They could see the effect: American units that refused to break no matter how many leaders they lost. But they could not see the cause, because the cause was not a tactic or a weapon. It was a training philosophy that had been running in camps across the United States for 2 years before those helmets ever touched Norman soil. And that training philosophy had one more feature, one that became visible not in how American squads fought, but in how they communicated on a battlefield where nothing worked the way it was supposed to. The marks on the helmets were only the beginning. The Americans had built an entire visual language into their army, a language that every soldier could read at a glance, without a radio, without a written order, without a single word spoken. And when German intelligence officers finally cataloged that language, what they found was not a communication system. It was a confession, written in paint and stencil, that the American Army did not trust its own plans to survive the first 5 minutes of contact. By the autumn of 1944, German intelligence sections across the Western Front had assembled something remarkable: a growing catalog of every marking found on captured American helmets, vehicles, and equipment. Unit symbols, colored geometric shapes, numbered codes, rank bars, regimental crests, divisional patches painted directly onto steel. The catalog ran to dozens of pages, and it told a story that no single helmet could tell alone. Every American division had its own emblem painted on the front or side of its men's helmets. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, wore a red numeral on an olive shield. The 29th Division wore its blue and gray yin-yang circle. The 4th Division wore 4 ivy leaves. These were not hidden. They were not subtle. A German observer with a decent pair of binoculars could identify which American division he was facing by looking at a single helmet from across a field. In the German army, this kind of information was treated as a secret. The order to remove divisional markings from vehicles in 1943 had been explicit. The enemy must not know which unit is where, because that knowledge allows him to predict your strength, your reserves, your next move. German intelligence officers spent enormous effort trying to determine the Allied order of battle, which divisions were in the line, which were in reserve, which had been pulled back for refitting. It was painstaking work, built on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts. And here were the Americans, painting the answer on the outside of their helmets. The German assumption was that this was sloppiness, the carelessness of an army that had not yet learned the cost of operational security. Some intelligence reports from the summer of 1944 dismissed the markings as amateurish. One staff officer at the division level noted that the Americans were practically inviting the Germans to read their dispositions. But there was a problem with that reading. The Americans were winning. And as the months went on, as German intelligence officers accumulated more helmets and more data, a more uncomfortable interpretation began to emerge. The Americans were not being careless. They were making a trade. And the trade was deliberate. They were trading secrecy for speed. Consider what happens when an American rifleman is separated from his unit in the chaos of a hedgerow fight. In the German army, he has almost no way to identify a stranger's unit at a glance. Shoulder boards tell rank but not division. Collar tabs tell branch but not regiment. A lost German soldier must ask, and asking takes time, creates noise, and assumes you encounter someone who speaks your dialect and is willing to stop moving long enough to answer. The American soldier looks at a helmet. He sees a red diamond, 5th Infantry Division. He sees a horizontal bar, NCO. He sees the man is moving toward a road junction with purpose. In 3 seconds, without a word, he knows. That man is not from my unit, but he is a sergeant heading somewhere specific. Follow or find your own. Now multiply that by 10,000 men across a fluid, chaotic front where units intermix, flanks collapse, counterattacks split companies, and the neat lines on the operations map bear no resemblance to the tangle of men and machines on the ground. The American visual system was not about identifying units to the enemy. It was about allowing strangers to become a functioning group in minutes, without radios, without orders, without a shared chain of command. This is the detail that separated the American approach from every European army of the 20th century. The British used formation patches, colored shapes on the upper sleeve, but these were small, muted, and meant primarily for rear area identification. The Germans used tactical symbols on vehicles, but stripped them in combat zones. The Soviets used almost no visible unit identification at all. Only the Americans painted everything. Rank, unit, division, regiment, battalion, on the one piece of equipment that was always visible, always worn, always facing the man behind you. And they did it because they had learned something in North Africa that fundamentally changed how they thought about battle. In February of 1943, at a place called Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the American army had suffered its worst defeat of the war. Rommel's Africa Corps had punched through green American positions and sent an entire corps reeling backward in confusion. Units broke, communications failed, battalions lost contact with their regiments. Retreating soldiers streamed past command posts that had no idea which units were still fighting and which had dissolved. The defeat was humiliating, and the lessons that came out of it shaped everything that followed. One of those lessons was about identification. In the confusion of the retreat, American soldiers could not find their units. American officers could not find their men. Stragglers from a dozen different companies wandered the roads, leaderless, unable to tell whether the men next to them were from their regiment or from a support unit 60 miles from where it was supposed to be. The army that went into Kasserine wore almost no visible identification. The army that came out of it began painting everything. After Kasserine, the Follow Me bar went from an informal tradition to a near-universal practice. After Kasserine, divisional emblems moved from the shoulder to the helmet. After Kasserine, the unspoken rule became, if a man can see your helmet, he should know who you are, what your rank is, and where you belong, without asking. This was not bravery. It was institutional learning at a speed that the German army could not match. Kasserine happened in February. By July, in Sicily, the same units were fighting with a visual identification system that let shattered companies reassemble in hours instead of days. By June of 1944, that system had been refined to the point where the 101st Airborne could scatter 6,000 men across Normandy in the dark and expect them to find each other by the symbols on their helmets. The Germans saw the markings and thought vulnerability. The Americans had looked at the same markings and seen resilience, the ability to break apart and reform, like Mercury, finding new shapes under pressure. Remember the German intelligence officer in Como, turning those 3 helmets in his hands? He saw 3 targets. What he was actually holding was the visible surface of an army that had been designed, from the ground up, to survive its own destruction. But survival is one thing. What that army did next, what the Follow Me bar made possible in the 5 weeks between D-Day and the breakout at Saint-Lô, was something that went beyond resilience. It was adaptation. And it happened at a speed that the officers writing those intelligence reports could measure, but could not explain. In the hedgerows south of Omaha Beach, in the first weeks of July 1944, something happened that military historians have struggled to categorize ever since. It was not a single battle. It was not a single order. It was 1,000 small decisions, made by men whose names appear in no history book, that collectively solved a tactical problem the entire Allied planning apparatus had failed to anticipate. The problem was simple. The hedgerows were killing the American army. Every field in the bocage was a rectangle, roughly the size of a football pitch, enclosed by earthen walls 5 centuries old. A rifle platoon attacking across one field had to cross open ground under fire from a machine gun position it could not see, behind a wall it could not penetrate, supported by mortars pre-registered on the exact center of the field. A single German squad, 8 men, could hold one field against a full platoon for hours. And there were thousands of fields between the beaches and Saint-Lô. Division and Corps headquarters had no solution. The pre-invasion planning had focused on the beach assault and the breakout beyond. The bocage was supposed to be transitional terrain, a few days of hard fighting before the army reached open ground. No one had planned for a campaign measured in hedgerows per day. The solution came from below. It came from staff sergeants and buck sergeants and privates who had been in the hedgerows long enough to learn what killed men and what kept them alive. And it spread through the army in a way that had no German parallel, not through official doctrine, not through orders from above, but through a lateral network of men who wore horizontal stripes on their helmets, talking to other men who wore horizontal stripes on their helmets. A sergeant in the 29th Division figured out that you could blow a hole in a hedgerow with a shaped charge placed at the base, and that if you timed the infantry assault to go through the gap at the same moment the charge detonated, the German machine gunner on the far side would still be flinching when the first American came through. He told the sergeant in the next platoon. That sergeant told his company's first sergeant. Within a week, the technique was spreading across the battalion. Another sergeant, no one recorded his name, discovered that a tank could survive a hedgerow crossing if it stayed low instead of climbing over the top, where its thin belly armor was exposed. He suggested welding steel teeth to the front hull, scrap metal cut from German beach obstacles, so the tank could bite into the hedgerow and push through at ground level. That idea reached a sergeant named Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, who built the first working prototype from the steel rails that Rommel had planted on the beaches to stop the invasion. Within weeks, maintenance units across First Army were welding what soldiers called rhino tusks onto every Sherman they could reach. None of this came from a general. None of it came from a planning staff. It came from the men with the stripes. And here is what connects the rhino tusk to the Follow Me bar on the back of a helmet. Both were products of the same system, a system that had trained its NCOs not just to execute orders, but to observe, to improvise, to solve problems at their level without waiting for permission from above. In the German army, a tactical innovation of this kind would have followed a different path. A frontline NCO might notice a problem and report it upward. The report would travel through the company commander to the battalion, from the battalion to the regiment, from the regiment to the division. If the division staff judged the innovation worthy, they would issue a directive. The directive would travel back down the same chain. The process could take weeks. It was thorough, professional, and slow. The American system was messy, informal, and fast. A sergeant figured something out on Tuesday. By Thursday, the sergeant in the next company was trying it. By the following week, a battalion S3, a training and operations officer, had written it into a mimeographed sheet that went to every platoon leader in the regiment. Within a month, First Army Headquarters had published a lessons learned bulletin incorporating innovations that had originated in foxholes. The speed of that cycle, problem to solution to dissemination, was something that German intelligence could observe but could not replicate. Because it depended on a layer of the army that the German system had never empowered in the same way: the non-commissioned officer. Remember the number. In 1941, NCOs were 20% of the American enlisted force. By 1945, they were 50%. That number is not just a statistic. It describes a density of leadership that had no equivalent in any other army in the war. In a 12-man American squad, the squad leader was a staff sergeant. The assistant squad leader was a sergeant. Each fire team had a corporal or a senior PFC at its head. Half the squad held some form of leadership responsibility. In a German Gruppe of the same period, typically 10 men, the Gruppenführer was a single Unteroffizier. He had no designated deputy with tactical authority. If he fell, the most senior Gefreiter was expected to maintain discipline and hold position, not to maneuver, not to adapt, not to lead. The difference was not courage. German infantrymen were, by any measure, among the most formidable soldiers of the 20th century. The difference was structural. The German squad had one brain. The American squad had 4 or 5. And those 4 or 5 brains were visible, marked, painted on the back of a helmet in white enamel so that every rifleman in the squad could see at every moment where his leaders were and how many of them were still standing. By late July, when Operation Cobra finally broke the American army out of the hedgerows, the units that poured through the breach bore almost no resemblance to the units that had landed 7 weeks earlier. Their original officers were largely gone, killed, wounded, evacuated. Their original NCOs had been cycled through at staggering rates. In some rifle companies, not a single man who had waded ashore on D-Day was still present. And yet, the companies fought. The platoons maneuvered. The squads advanced. The men wearing the stripes were new. The stripes themselves had been repainted. Fresh white enamel over mud-caked steel, sometimes for the 3rd or 4th time on the same helmet. But the system behind the stripes had never stopped working. The German army, watching from the other side of the hedgerows, saw an enemy that could not be decapitated. And in that observation lay the answer to the question that had started in a stone farmhouse in Como, with a German intelligence officer turning a mud-covered helmet in his hands. By the autumn of 1944, the war had moved east of Paris, and the German army was no longer confused by the marks on American helmets. It was frightened by what they represented. The distinction matters. Confusion is an intelligence problem. You see something you do not understand, and you study it until you do. Fear is an operational problem. You understand what you are facing, and you realize you cannot answer it. German officers captured in the fall and winter of 1944 were interrogated at length by Allied intelligence teams. The transcripts of those interrogations, dry procedural documents filed in folders and forgotten for decades, contain, scattered among routine questions about unit strength and morale, a pattern of observations that no single officer could have assembled alone, but that, taken together, describe a dawning recognition. A German major captured near Aachen in October said that American units recovered from the loss of officers faster than any force he had encountered in 5 years of war, including the Russians, who simply threw more bodies forward regardless of casualties. The Americans, he said, did not throw bodies. They reorganized, quickly, as if they had practiced it. He was right. They had. A Hauptmann taken near the Hürtgen forest in November noted that it was nearly impossible to paralyze an American company by killing its commander, because within minutes a sergeant would assume control, and the unit would resume its attack, sometimes from a different direction, which suggested the sergeant was not merely continuing the dead officer's plan, but making a new one. This, the Hauptmann said, was not something German NCOs were trained to do. He used the word erstaunlich, astonishing. A lieutenant captured during the Ardennes counteroffensive in December, the Battle of the Bulge, described an engagement in which his platoon overran an American position and captured several helmets along with other equipment. He noticed that nearly every helmet bore some form of marking, rank bars, unit symbols, sometimes both. He asked, through his interrogator, why the Americans would mark their leaders so openly. Did they not understand that this made them targets? The interrogator noted that when the answer was explained, that the markings existed so that any soldier could identify and follow the nearest leader in conditions of chaos, the German lieutenant sat quietly for a long moment and then said something that the interrogator recorded verbatim, in German, before translating. He said, "Then they have already planned for everything we can do to them." That single sentence contains the entire answer to the question in the title of this video. The marks on American helmets baffled German officers because, within the framework of European military tradition, marking your leaders was an act of self-destruction. You were handing the enemy a target list. You were telling his snipers exactly whom to kill to break your unit. But that logic only held if your army depended on its leaders the way the German army depended on its leaders, as irreplaceable specialists whose training could not be reproduced quickly, whose loss created a vacuum that the men below them could not fill. The American army had built something different. It had built a system in which leadership was not a specialized function performed by a trained elite. It was a distributed capability, seeded into every layer of the organization, from the staff sergeant to the private. The helmet markings were not a vulnerability. They were an expression of depth, a visible declaration that this army had so many men prepared to lead that it could afford to show the enemy exactly where they were. This was not arrogance, it was arithmetic. The American training pipeline was producing leaders at a rate that German losses could exploit but never exhaust. For every sergeant killed in the hedgerows, the system produced another, not as experienced, not as polished, but trained in the same basic skills: assess, decide, move. For every officer lost, a senior NCO stepped up who had been practicing for exactly that moment since basic training. The German system could not do this. Not because it was inferior, in many ways it was more sophisticated, but because it was built on a different assumption. The German assumption was that leadership required years of professional education and a culture of initiative cultivated over a military lifetime. The American assumption was that leadership, at its most essential level, was a trainable skill that could be stamped into a man in 17 weeks and activated by necessity. Both assumptions contained truth. The German officer was, on average, better prepared for command than his American counterpart. He thought in broader terms, planned with greater precision, and operated with more tactical elegance. But he could not be replaced. And in a war of attrition, on a front where officer casualties ran to 300% over the course of a campaign, the army that could replace its leaders faster would outlast the army that could not. The marks on the helmets were the visible evidence of that calculus. Every white stripe said, "This man leads." But underneath that simple message was a deeper one, invisible to the naked eye, but legible to anyone who understood what the American army had become by the summer of 1944. The deeper message was, "And when this man falls, the next man is ready." The German lieutenant captured in the Ardennes understood that message the moment it was explained to him. Then they have already planned for everything we can do to them. He did not mean that the Americans had anticipated every tactic. He meant something worse. He meant that the American system had absorbed the certainty of its own losses into its basic design, had made the death of its leaders not a catastrophe, but a transition, smooth enough that the enemy could not even detect the moment it happened. That is what the marks on the helmets meant. Not identification, not tradition, not carelessness. They meant that the American army had looked at the oldest problem in warfare. What happens when the leader dies? and had answered it so thoroughly that it could afford to paint the answer on the outside of a steel helmet in white, where the whole world could see. And there is one more thing, one detail that brings this story back to where it began, to that stone farmhouse in Caumont, and to the man who sat behind the table and wrote the word deliberately in his report. He was right. It was deliberate. But what was deliberate was not the marking. It was the entire system behind it. The farmhouse outside Caumont-Levante did not survive the war. Allied artillery flattened most of the stone buildings along the road to Saint-Lô in the last days of July, when Operation Cobra turned the hedgerow stalemate into a rout. The table where the German intelligence officer had examined those 3 helmets was buried under rubble that French farmers would spend years clearing. The 352nd Infantry Division, the unit that had defended Omaha Beach and held the bocage for 7 brutal weeks, ceased to exist as a fighting force by the end of August 1944. It was rebuilt twice more before the war ended, each time with fewer experienced men, each time a thinner shadow of the division that had nearly thrown the Americans back into the sea on June 6th. The intelligence officer's report, the one with the word deliberately underlined, was filed with thousands of others in a divisional archive that was captured by American forces in the spring of 1945. It was catalogued, translated, microfilmed, and sent to a warehouse in Maryland, where it sat in a cardboard box for decades. No one knows his name. He likely survived the war. Most intelligence officers did. He likely went home to a country in ruins and never spoke about the helmets again. The helmets themselves followed different paths. Thousands of M1s were collected from battlefields across France, cleaned, repainted, reissued to replacement troops arriving from England and the United States. A helmet taken from a dead sergeant of the 29th Division in June might have been on the head of a replacement private in the 4th Division by August. The same steel pot, the same follow me bar, painted over and painted again, carrying a new man toward a new hedgerow. Some survived. They sit today in museum cases and private collections, in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, in farmhouses in Normandy, in the attics of families who never quite knew what the white stripe on the back meant. The paint has faded, the liners have cracked. The leather chin straps have stiffened into shapes that still hold the memory of a jaw. The system that those helmets represented did not fade. The Follow Me bar survived Korea, where it was painted on the helmets of men fighting in frozen valleys that looked nothing like Normandy, but demanded the same thing. A private who could look up, find a stripe, and move. It survived Vietnam, where the card suits of the 101st Airborne returned to helmets in the Central Highlands, 50 years after they had first been painted in an English barracks before D-Day. It survived because the principle behind it never stopped being true. Plans fail, radios break, officers die. And when they do, the man behind you needs to know who you are. The German army that fought in Normandy was, by most professional measures, one of the finest military instruments ever built. Its officers were brilliant. Its doctrine was elegant. Its soldiers were brave beyond question. But its system contained a flaw that no amount of brilliance could overcome. It had placed the weight of leadership on a narrow class of professionals, and when that class was destroyed, the system broke. Not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, from Normandy to the Rhine. The American army that faced it was, by those same professional measures, cruder. Its officers were often learning on the job. Its doctrine was borrowed, improvised, revised on the fly. Its soldiers were civilians in uniform, scared and homesick and younger than they should have been. But its system had done something that the German system had not. It had looked at the certainty of chaos and built chaos into the design. It had taken the most fragile element of any army, the leader, and made him replaceable. Not expendable, replaceable. Every man behind him trained to step forward, every helmet behind his marked so that the transition would be seamless. A white vertical stripe for the officer, a white horizontal stripe for the sergeant, a spade, a heart, a diamond, a club for the regiment, a tick mark for the battalion, a colored circle for the division. All of it painted in the open, visible to the enemy, visible to the sniper, and visible to the 19-year-old private from Ohio who had been in France for 6 days and needed to know, right now, in the smoke and noise of a hedgerow he would never learn the name of, one simple thing. Who do I follow? The marks on American helmets baffled German officers because they answered a question the German army had never thought to ask. Not how do you protect your leaders, but what happens after they are gone? The Americans had answered that question before they ever left England. They had answered it in paint. Thank you for being here for the full 64 minutes. It genuinely means something to know that you stayed for a story like this. A story that was not about a single hero or a single battle, but about a system built by millions of ordinary people who were trained to do an extraordinary thing: lead when no one asked them to. If you found this worth your time, a like helps this video reach the people who would care about it, the ones who grew up hearing these stories at a kitchen table, or who never heard them at all. Subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, I would like to hear about them. Their stories are why this channel exists.